Welcome to the Quiet Casefiles, a place for calm, thoughtful mysteries told slowly and without urgency. Each episode is a fictional whodunit, and you are invited to listen closely and see if you can solve the case before it is quietly resolved. If you enjoy these stories, consider liking, subscribing, and following the channel. And as always, please keep the comments spoiler-free so everyone can enjoy the mystery. I arrived at Marigold Ridge in a whisper of gravel and breath. The lane leading to the vineyard was soft with the first thin frost of late autumn, the vines stripped to their bones and the soil folded under a morning mist. The tasting room and low, pale house looked as if they had been set down to wait for spring, small lanterns in the windows making quiet promises against the cold. Marigold Ridge was closing for the season, its harvest put away, its barrels tucked and baited, and tonight there would be a private last tasting, an evening to mark an ending and perhaps decide a future. I had been invited by Celeste Martin, who owned the place with a stubborn, gentle care. I had known her only by letter and by the light of a single phone call some weeks before, when she wrote that she wanted the vineyard to be seen one last time before winter, and that she hoped to bring together a few people whose paths had touched hers in different ways. She liked small, deliberate gatherings, she had said. She liked to know who had walked on her land. It was the right sort of invitation for someone who notices little things more than great statements. I do not call myself a detective. I merely listen, and I collect patterns like pebbles in a pocket. They make a comfortable wait later, in the quiet, when events settle, and meaning has time to show its face. The guests arrived in ones and twos, each with a reason that, in the small light of the lane, seemed sensible and unremarkable. Marco Alvarez, the head winemaker, arrived with his hands already smelling faintly of oak and yeast. He had been at Marigold Ridge for nearly a decade. His concern was obvious and practical, the sort of worry that grows from knowing which barrels need attention and which vines will not forgive neglect. He carried himself like someone who had slept in the cellar more than he had slept at home. Harriet Lyle came from the city, a wine critic by trade, notebook already in her pocket. A reason for being was her profession, and also something quieter. Celeste had once mentioned to me in a short voice over tea that Harriet had been a friend earlier in life, and that they had fallen into a complicated silence. Harriet had come to taste, and perhaps to mend or to witness. Sometimes critics are the only auditors of memory. Daniel Price introduced himself with the polite confidence of a man who measures places by potential. He was a realtor, a local who had been looking at properties in the region. He had suggested to Celeste that there might be a buyer who would keep the vines and also pay handsomely. His papers, folded in a neat leather folder, gave the lie to the idea that he was merely here for the wine. Lila Monroe arrived with a bundle of dried flowers and a shawl that smelled faintly of lavender. Lila was a friend of Celeste, someone who brought arrangements for the tasting events and who had known the property as refuge more than as business. Her hands, the way she smoothed her scarf, suggested a person who measures time by the turning of seasons rather than the ticking of contracts. And Jonah Reed, he was Celeste's nephew, more complicated to name in passing. He had come back to the land after years away. I noticed, before I noticed anything else about him, that his fingers kept touching the inside pocket of his jacket, the pocket where he kept a small flattened tin of seeds and folded paper. He had the nervous habit of jingling it when he walked, more out of force of habit than of thought. Celeste had spoken of him in a way that made me think of two people who had shared more silence than words. That was the group. Celeste met us in the front room, a small place with a long wooden table and a view that looked down the rows of the nearest vines. She wore a cardigan that had seen many seasons and a bracelet of old brass that caught the light at the exact moments she paused. She moved with the economy of someone who had lived a long while on the rhythm of the land. "I am glad you are all here," she said, her voice as steady as the table under my palm. "I wanted to pour the last of the late cuvee, and I wanted you to taste what we have shared." There was a small decanter on the table, the glass worn soft at the mouth from years of being handled. Celeste handled it as if it were a small living thing, a vessel she had learned to rely on. She also kept a ledger on the shelf above the desk, a slim book bound in leather and closed each evening with a small brass paperweight. She had shown me that habit earlier, saying that the paperweight meant the business was finished for the day. These habits were the sort of things I pay attention to. They become anchors when something later is missing. The weather kept us close. The last of the harvest had been quiet, the machines put away, the rows empty and patient. We sampled the wine slowly, each person in turn offering a small remark, a memory of the vineyard or an opinion about the tannins. Conversation folded itself around the table in the manner of people who may have been strangers to one another, but shared the same roast of earth and grape. It felt to me like an honest evening. People were where they had reason to be. The windmaker kept watch over barrels, the critic kept watch over taste, the caller of contracts kept watch over possibility, the friend kept watch over soft things like dried flowers and conversations. The nephew kept watch over, perhaps, a return. Nobody seemed forced to be there. Each person brought a private garden of concerns, small human things that I made a note of as I learned names and gestures. At the end of the night, Celeste said she would go to her office to fetch an old photograph she wanted us to see. She rose and left the room with a light in her eyes, the sort of light someone has when they remember a kindness. She closed the door softly behind her. I watched the door, and I watched how each person moved when she pulled away. Marco half rose to follow, then sat. Harriet flipped a page in her notebook. Joan had touched the flat tin in his pocket and, for a moment, looked as if he might stand. Small things. Habits. A decanter, a ledger, a paperweight, a pocket tin. They mattered then, in the warm hush of the tasting room, as the lambent view of the vineyard narrowed and the evening took on the small gravity of endings. I preferred to hold those small weights before the night unfolded. It is good sometimes to name these details and let them sit. They will, in the morning, be the map I follow. The tasting continued without hurry. People tasted as though they were reading weather, making small notes about the body and the finish, about how the late cuvee held a bitter edge that softened into something like old wood. Conversation moved in short arcs, tales of harvests past, comments about the strange softness of the August rain, the small business of keeping a place afloat in a colder economy. I paid attention to rhythm. Marco had a way of tapping the table twice before he spoke, and twice after. He used his hands in a particular motion when he described the barrel rooms. Harriet had a deliberate plan for tasting, pulling the glass away from her mouth to jot an observation. Daniel watched everyone as if trying to measure, in the white of their eyes, how much attachment they had to what he had come to think as potential. Leela moved as if she were always setting down invisible bouquets. Jonah, who wandered to the window twice as if he were not certain where to stand, had a habit of checking his watch and then rubbing the leather of his jacket where a small tin sat folded and warm. There was no argument that evening, only a line of tension that ran where the business world met memory. Celeste was kind and economical. She allowed the tasting to unfold and then said quietly that she had left a stack of letters in her office. She wanted to show us a photograph, she said, because it was time that certain things were seen. I keep a ledger up there, she said, and she tapped the shelf. I put papers in it and close it with the paperweight. It is silly, but it makes me feel the day is over. Her fingers closed on the decanter with the sort of reverence that made me think of old tools. She had, earlier in the day, shown me a sealed envelope with a white ribbon sealed to it. She had not said what it contained beyond that it would have to wait until we were all assembled and that she thought the last cuvee deserved company. As the night deepened and the lanterns burned lower, Jonah stood and said he would check the irrigation lines. He walked out through the back door and the frost brightened under his boots. It was the sort of small errand anyone might run on a property of this scale, and the path that led to the pump room ran near the office windows. Marco called out, half joking, for him to be quick. Jonah waved and was away. I noted the departure without much wait. He had gone alone and returned alone. We lingered over the second glass. Harriet asked Celeste about the photograph, and Celeste smiled as if she had been waiting for that question. "It is an old one," she said. "You cannot sell the land without remembering who walked it." Daniel laughed softly as if recalling a negotiation. "A worthy sentiment," he said, "but some things also need keeping. The balance is tricky." His folder rested at his elbow. I remember noticing how he kept one finger between the leaves, a small habit that made the papers seem less like tools and more like promises. At one point, Lila moved to rearrange the dried flowers on the windowsill and found herself by the office door. "She will be back soon," she said to no one in particular, "and there's a photograph she promised." When Celeste did not return for a while, the group grew quiet in a manner more marked than the first silence of the evening. I watched how the empty chair at the table seemed to gather a small gravity, the way people fill gaps in conversation with small observations. Marco, who had been watching the door, said he would check. He moved through the room with the steady gait of someone who knows the house by sound. He paused at the office door, which was closed. After a moment he opened it and found it locked. He returned to the table and said nothing beyond the obvious, that she must have gone to the cellar or the back porch. There was one more small detail that evening I kept in the pocket of my mind. I had watched Jonah at the table as he sat with his hands in the jacket where the flattened tin rattled on occasion. Once, when he laughed, the sound seemed forced. Later, when he rose to help Marco, he brushed his sleeve and I glimpsed on the cuff a faint smear, the sort of mark one might get from handling glass or soil. It was small and could be nothing, but these are the things I note. Habits become a story if they repeat. We did not stay in the tasting room for long after that. Celeste returned finally, carrying the photograph. She moved with a quiet composure and placed the image on the table. The photograph was of a younger Celeste, arms around a boy with a thin face and a crooked smile. Jonah, at the sight of it, went pale. Lila touched Celeste's hand. Harriet looked down and said nothing. Daniel folded his hands tighter on his papers. "I thought you should see this," Celeste said. "Some things need to be remembered before they can be planned for." There was a softness to her voice that evening, a tiredness. She said that she had been thinking about the future of the place, about whether it should be sold or put into a trust. She did not say which she would do. She did say that certain people should know what she remembered of the past. It was not in itself a dramatic announcement. It was what she said it was, an invitation to consider, to taste the wine as you would taste a decision. But beneath the ordinary phrasing, there was a current. Plans had consequences. A trust changes a life. A sale changes a town. This was the quiet friction that had brought us together. When we left the tasting room to go to bed, the house settled around us like a reaching hand. The lanterns were snuffed and the frost made a thin glass over the garden. Jonah lingered by the sink, his palm on the wood, the tin in his pocket. He gave me a quick look as if to measure me, then walked away. I thought then, not yet with any weight, that people carried with them objects that made their stories easier to hold. Those small things would, in the morning, be where the map began. Morning arrived like a slow exhale. The sky was the color of old paper, and a thin frost traced the vineyard rows in pale ink. I woke early and made my way to the kitchen for tea. The house smelled of coffee and wood smoke. It was the sort of ordinary morning that makes it harder, when the other shoe falls, to reconcile the everyday with the sudden wound of tragedy. Leela found Celeste first. She had gone to the office because she wanted to see the ledger and the photograph again. The office door was closed. Leela knocked, and when no answer came, she pushed it open with the gentleness that suggested she thought Celeste might be napping in the chair. It was Marco who called my name then, and his voice did not fit the early light. I walked into the office and saw Celeste at the desk, slumped forward as if asleep. The paperweight lay on the shelf where she usually placed it. The decanter I had watched her carry the evening before was absent from the table. There was a half-full glass near her hand. The discovery feels, in recollection, both immediate and slow. There was no scene of violence. The house was quiet, only the clock on the mantel keeping time, as if this small instrument were holding the ordinary while the rest of the world tilted. I touched her shoulder gently, and the skin was cool in a way that made my chest narrow. We did not dramatize our shock. The people in the room moved precisely, as people who know how to mind the living in the presence of the dead. Marco closed the office door. Leela made a soft sound like someone who has been startled awake. Harriet reached for her notebook, but did not write. Jonah stood with his hands in his pockets, staring at the photograph that lay in the dust of the desk lamp. A call was made for the constable in the nearest town. The weather had thickened and the road would be slow. Until the authorities arrived, we were a small group waiting on a house that had become the scene of a thing no one among us had expected. The initial observations were sparse and careful. There was no sign of forced entry. The window was closed. The paperweight lay where Celeste normally put it, which meant that if anyone had wanted to search the ledger or the papers, they would have known the routine, and perhaps respected it. The decanter was missing. No one had seen Celeste leave the office after she shut the door the night before. I walked the room slowly, the way I take apart a clock without pulling it to pieces. There was a faint smell in the air that I could not name at first. It was not quite of the wine we had drunk. It had a sharper edge, like the scent of almonds, if you only half recall that smell. I made a note of that. Muscle memory will urge you not to name things you do not know, because naming can be a kind of verdict. I preferred to keep it as an observation until I had more than the single note. Celeste's ledger was closed. The ribbon that had bound the envelope she had shown us was folded on top of it. There were, to the casual eye, no letters strewn, no ransacking. The room had the ordered look of someone who had been interrupted in the middle of a routine. The constable arrived and took the charge with a quiet efficiency that steadied more than it relieved. He asked simple questions in a low voice. Who had been here? Who had gone to bed first? Who had seen whom? The voices around the table each gave their answers with the strain that accompanies new grief. Jonah said he had gone out to check the irrigation pump at a little after 10, and then he had returned to the house and sat by the fire. Marco said he had been in the cellar, finishing a last check of the barrels, and had come upstairs to find the office door closed. Harriet said she had retired early with notes and could not explain the absence. Daniel said he had been reviewing papers in his room and had not heard anything unusual. Alibis are gentle things in a small house. They are often patterns rather than absolutes. I listened not to the specifics alone, but to how people told them, the pauses, the little shifts in hands, the way Jonah kept returning to the image in the photograph as if sheltering his eyes from a light he did not want to meet. After the constable had taken initial statements, he said they would wait for the medical examiner from the county to determine cause of death. For the moment, the death was quiet and ambiguous. There were no obvious marks, nothing to suggest a struggle. The glass by Celeste's hand had wine in it. The decanter was missing. The paperweight lay in its usual place. We were asked to stay in the house until the roads were clear enough for an official vehicle to pass. The guests dispersed into small clusters of conversation that avoided the center of the loss. I stood by the window and watched the vineyard unroll into the frost. The rows were like the lines you get when you run a finger over sleet. They knew their rhythm and kept it. The morning held a series of small discoveries. Harriet returned with a folded napkin. There was a faint smear on one corner of Celeste's sleeve, a mark that could have been from wine or from something else. Marco found, behind a low stack of papers, a torn scrap of vellum that had a single typed word, trust. It had the look of being torn from an envelope rather than a page. When the medical examiner arrived an hour later, she moved through the office with the same small, methodical air as the constable. I watched her, not intervening. She did not make grand pronouncements. She said we should give the house privacy and that a full report would be available later. For now, she asked us to remain nearby and not to touch anything. That is how the day went. A slow increase in gravity, a series of small facts arranging themselves into a mosaic that had, at its center, a quiet and awful impossibility. We were guests in a house whose keeper had been made still. The place that had been a meeting ground had become again a place that kept secrets. My job, such as it is, had only just begun. I went back to the vantage point of the tasting room and sat, listening to the way breath moved in the house. People moved in patterns of habit, even when the world had shifted. The decanter was gone. The ledger sat with a paperweight. Jonah was at the window, looking at the vines. Those small observations, collected one by one, would be the threads with which the day would later be made legible. The constable kept to a careful routine. He took notes, asked witness questions, kept us together and calm. The medical examiner spoke with a quiet professionalism. The word cause, when it came, was offered hesitantly. There was no visible trauma. Celeste had been found at her desk. The examiner suggested that the cause was not immediately apparent and that toxicology would take time. The word toxicology landed in the room like a pebble dropped into still water. The ripples reached into hands and faces and into the careful stories people told about where they had been the night before. Questioning is not an interrogation in a small house. It is a collection of attempts to put time in place. Who went where? Who left when? Who had reason to be at a certain desk? People recount their ordinary movements and, in the telling, sometimes give away habits they had thought small and private. I listened to the constable and to the others, not in the manner of someone seeking to trap, but as someone who knows that the truth often leaves itself a path of ordinary things. Marco explained his rounds in the cellar. He spoke of checking barrels by temperature and weight, of ensuring that the last cuvee had the air it needed while the house slept. I was down there until late, he said. I came up and the office door was closed. I thought she might be reading. I didn't knock because she often worked late. Harriet spoke of her notes. She had been reviewing her impressions and when she looked up, had found Celeste had gone from the room. She said she had no reason to visit the office late and preferred to keep pockets of solitude for her thoughts. Daniel, polite and composed, gave a precise enough accounting that it sounded prepared. He said he had been in his room looking over folders and had not seen Celeste leave. Jonah's account had a different texture. I walked out to check the pump, he said, and then I came back and read by the fire. I didn't think anything of it. The constable leaned forward and asked him what time the visit had been, and Jonah scratched a date into the air with his finger, as if asking himself. There was a gap in his memory, a soft place he could not quite name. He said he had gone around 10, maybe 10:30. People give times like that when they do not have a timetable to consult. It is not necessarily deceit. It can be the way memory loosens at night. What I listened for were the small returns, repeated phrases, the tiny hesitations. Jonah kept returning his hand to his jacket where the flattened tin lay. He said his mother had left him a small packet of seeds, a thing he kept for luck. He did not volunteer that the tin sometimes contained pills or that he had been addicted once and was carrying reminders of a past he was trying to move past. He did not need to tell me those things. They were in the way his fingers rubbed the leather. The constable asked to know who had had access to the office. I could see on his brow the practical concern. In a small place, access is often communal. Marco had the keys for utility reasons. Celeste kept her own key. Jonah, being family, had been given spare access long ago, but had not used it for years. Someone asked about the decanter. Marco said, with a motion of apology, that he could not account for it. Celeste carried that one for years, he said. She used it for the special casks and kept it near the desk at night. The mention of the decanter sent a new thread into the room, the missing object that had been in Celeste's hands the night before. Someone should have seen it. Someone should have noticed if it was removed. But our memories are porous. Sometimes we bear witness only to the presence of the ordinary. As the questions continued, Harriet handed her notebook quietly to the constable. She had written down observations and had, at one point, recorded an argument she had overheard months before between Celeste and Daniel about the terms of sale. It was not a current quarrel, she said, but old bone can sometimes ache. Daniel acknowledged the older conversation with a diplomatic nod. People negotiate, he said. Celeste knows what she wants. We were discussing possibilities, not specifics. I spoke less frequently than the others. I asked one or two questions about small habits. Celeste places the paperweight on the ledger each night, I said. Did she have a routine about who might go into the office after lights out? Marco said no. She liked the office to be private, he said. Whoever goes, she usually knows. There was a moment when Jonah's gaze lifted to the photograph on the desk. I remembered then that Celeste had shown me a sealed envelope the night before, a paper with white ribbon that she had called private. No one had seen her touch it since. The envelope, he said slowly. She said she had letters up there. The constable made a notation. The word letters then, and the scrapped vellum that said trust surfaced in the same movement. It began to seem likely that Celeste had been preparing, in some manner, to formalize something about the vineyard. The idea of a trust had been mentioned. The torn scrap had the sharpness of being recently read. Small inconsistencies began to show themselves like threads pulled from an old sweater. Jonah could not be sure of every minute he had spent in the night. Daniel seemed intent on preserving possibility. Marco looked like a man who knew the heart of the place. Harriet had a page of notes that described old disagreements as well as fondness. Lila kept to the edges of conversations as if she were keeping the fragile things safe. I took to walking the rooms and listening to how each person inhabits silence. People speak in different volumes when they are telling the truth. Some facts are loud, paperweights, decanters, photographs. Some facts are quiet, the way a hand rubs a pocket, the way a person pauses before mentioning a name. I had a small private conversation with Marco. He told me in an aside that Celeste had been less certain in recent weeks, that she had talked about a trust to protect the land from developers and from certain offers she did not trust. Marco said he had been hopeful the vineyard would remain handsomely managed, perhaps under a conservancy. He also suggested, with the deep sadness of someone who tends the vines, that such changes leave people at the edge. There are always lives at the edge. When plans are made, there is always someone who will stand to lose more than another. The constable kept on with his routine. The medical examiner waited for tests, and we were asked to be patient. In a small house with a quiet death, patience is an awkward commodity. I had, by that time, gathered a list of small things. The paperweight had been on the shelf. The decanter was missing. Celeste had an envelope and a photograph. Jonah had been seen leaving the house alone the night before and had habits he did not speak of. These were not convictions. They were simply the shape of a question forming. I like to let questions sit. They often tell us more in repose than when shouted from a ledge. The day moved forward with the slow grace of people waiting for the right word. I watched faces and listened for the small cadence of truth. People reveal themselves most honestly in what they return to. I moved through the day gathering those returns like a person picking ripe fruit. Marco returned to the cellar several times, each return an anchor of practical grief. He opened and closed lids, listened to breathing barrels, and spoke softly to the wood as if it had ears. Harriet returned to her notebook and read certain lines out loud, not for anyone's benefit but for the comfort of the cadence. Daniel returned to the folder at his elbow, ignoring the small music of the house. Lila returned to the flower basket she had set in the window, and Jonah returned to the photograph on the desk. There were small, quiet inconsistencies that kept tugging at me. The decanter, which I had seen Celeste carry the night before, remained unaccounted for. No one could say where he had last seen it. The ledger was closed with the paperweight in place. A torn scrap of vellum bearing the typed word "Trust" lay near the desk lamp. A cup with wine was sitting, half full, at Celeste's right hand where she had been found. I asked Marco simply where he had been during the previous evening. He repeated the same sequence. He had been checking the new cask, making sure a bung was secure. There was a certain plausibility in the way he described the cellar, the way he spoke of the noises the wood made, as if speaking a language he understood. I watched his hands. They were lined with the faint ring of vinegar and stain that told the story of a life spent near barrels. At one point, as we were organizing what to do with the house until the authorities released it, I found myself in Jonah's room. He had left the door slightly ajar. The room smelled faintly of damp earth and the tang of a cigarette, though Cyril, the constable, had said no one had seen him smoke that night. On the bedside table was the small, flat tin I had noticed the first evening. It was open and empty. I put it down simply to see its weight. There was a small smear on the inside of the tin, as if something had been scraped from it and put into a cup. In itself it meant nothing, but I had already noticed the faint scent in the office that morning and the missing decanter. The small smear on the old seed tin had the shine of a film, a residue that might be wine, water, or something less specific. I walked the path that led from the kitchen out toward the backyard. Near the compost pile I found, half buried among the leaves, a piece of glass that had once been part of a stopper. It was not the decanter's stopper, I would learn that detail later, but it suggested that glass had been handled, moved, or even hidden. Things get hidden in small houses because they are tools more than trophies. One puts something away and then forgets why. That afternoon, Harriet handed me a photocopy of a page from her notebook. She had written a line that had seemed at the time a stray thought. Celeste and Jonah, she had noted, had met in odd ways, across seasons. She had a line from a letter, too, where Celeste wrote that she was thinking of preserving the land. Harriet's writing was the sort of careful witnessing that loved detail rather than drama. The constable had asked us to let him know if anything seemed to be missing, and so I kept a quiet list. I note things like paperweights and decanters because people return to them. The paperweight was where Celeste put it each night. The decanter was missing. The photograph was on the desk. The envelope that had been wrapped with ribbon remained in place atop the ledger. A small shift occurred when Lila told me, when we were alone by the window, of a conversation she had overheard weeks earlier. Celeste and Jonah argued about what should happen to the vineyard, she said. Jonah wants to sell for money, to go away. Celeste says the land is for the people who tend it, not for selling. It was not a loud thing. It was a conversation like two people trying to explain how a ground could be loved. That, as a fact, reframed the scrap of vellum that said trust. If Celeste had been thinking of a trust, it could protect the land from being sold. Jonah would lose an argument not only over money, but over belonging. I watched Jonah then as he moved about the house. There was a shadow around his mouth, as if he'd been thinking the same thing for a long time. I did not speak to him about it then. Much of the work I do is done without accusation. Patterns are not a rope to hang a person by. They are a way to understand where, in a knitted thing, the thread has been pulled. In the cellar, Marco showed me the cask that they had tasted the night before. He opened it carefully and let me smell the air above the wine. There is a vocabulary to these things, a way of describing the breath of a barrel, the sigh of oak. The cask held a scent of fruit and a faint metallic edge that I could not place. When I asked Marco about access to the decanter, he said he had not seen it since the night before, but that it was small and could be carried rather easily. As the day wore on, we learned more about the house's routines. Celeste, it was clear, closed down for the night in a precise way. She kept the office private and locked some drawers. She placed the paperweight as a sign the day's business was done. A trust, the torn scrap suggested, would rearrange all those quiet rituals. At dusk, the constable allowed one person to be present while the house was catalogued. Harriet sat by the desk, her notebook closed. She had, in a careful aside, mentioned that she had once seen Celeste put an envelope into the ledger and then close it with the paperweight. It felt, in the small arc of the day, like an action that could have been made to vanish. The pattern that had taken hold for me was simple. Celeste had routines. Someone had reason to change those routines. A decanter was missing. Jonah had a habit of touching the tin in his pocket and had been in and out of the night. None of it was proof. It was, however, a map of direction. So I walked the vineyard at evening, listening to the way the rows kept their silence, and thinking of the small acts that make up a life. I prefer to hold a map that is honest before I move to conclusions. The next morning, a low rain began, the kind that keeps to the land and changes the sound of footsteps to a softer, more measured rhythm. People grew quieter under the weather. The constable spoke of the difficulty of getting detectives from the county across the soft black roads. We had a kind of enforced intimacy, the sort that prompts small revelations, things people keep in pockets, facts people keep to the back of their minds. I found that suspicion is a shape that will settle itself into whatever space you offer. You speak of one detail and the room rearranges around it. Someone will seize upon a small fact to fill the rest. I tried, in my listening, to keep facts small and clear. A decanter was missing. A paperweight rested. There was a glass with wine at Celeste's right hand. Jonah had been at the pump. He had a tin in his pocket. But that, standing alone, is not evidence. It is a likelihood born of ordinary behavior. It became clearer as the rain drifted and the constable measured out the day's tasks that people were shifting how they occupied the house. Daniel kept to his documents. Harriet asked to see the ledger again, and I watched as her fingers skimmed the top as if searching for a single line. Lila was quiet, knitting words into her flowers. Marco checked the cellar with the sort of devotion that suggested he was trying to find meaning in the way something is kept. When I sat with Jonah in the back of the house for a brief while, he told me in a voice that had been narrowed by difficulties about his years away. He left young, he said, and had returned to find a life that had continued without him. She always said the land belongs to those who tend it, he said. I understand that. Still, things must be kept up. Money is necessary. There is no short way of listening to words like that. They must be allowed to settle. I did not press him with questions. People will tell you their worst impulses if you give them the room. Jonah touched the tin in his pocket and showed me, without much drama, a small amulet his mother had given him. It was a thing of sentimental value, and I made a note of that because sentimental objects often shape a person's actions. The constable found, in the garden near the compost, the missing decanter's stopper. It had been broken and discarded. That discovery tilted the room. The object had not been carefully hidden. It had been casually thrown away as if someone had, in the force of a moment, removed the decorative accoutrement of ritual. Someone had taken a piece of glass and left the heel of it in the leaves. Marco, who was present when the stopper was collected, went pale. "We do not throw things like that away," he said. If someone took the decanter apart, they knew what they were doing. The suggestion of knowledge introduced the possibility of experience. Someone who had handled delicate glassware in the cellar would understand which pieces to separate. A careless hand would not have left the stump of a stopper near the compost. That was a small clue that moved suspicion slightly. That afternoon, I noticed Daniel linger by the orchard wall, his folder open as if he were reading the ground. When I approached, he looked up with a business-like calm. "This place has potential," he said. "It requires investment. A trust could hinder that." He did not say whether that thought was a calm conviction or an urgent hope. Harriet, meanwhile, gave us a small note. She had found an old letter in Celeste's desk, folded and addressed to a man whose name matched Jonah's family. The letter spoke of keeping the land for a future generation and of promises made by an absent parent. Those words settled between Jonah and the photograph and looked very much like a map drawn for an ending. The constable also found a small metallic residue in the liner of a jacket in one of the guest rooms. It was not, at first glance, a dramatic thing, but traces are telling in their own way. If someone had carried a small amount of powder or liquid in a tin and then brushed up against the lining of a jacket, the jacket might keep it. A jacket is a mute witness. I kept returning to the way people moved in the house. Marco was practical and steady. Harriet was precise and sometimes distant. Daniel circled opportunities with a patience that wore into things. Leela held things soft, like tissue paper. Jonah was tight with his hands and often came back to the photograph as if trying to read something hidden in the grain of the paper. There is a particular kind of silence when someone realizes that the routine will not protect them. You can see it in the way their eyes dart to ordinary things. A key left in a dish, the paperweight on a shelf. People start to measure the house around the absence. That evening, a small but important item showed up in the grounds, a corner of a napkin, blackened as if it had been burned, found near the fire pit. On that napkin someone had scraped with a fingernail until a small piece of vellum came loose. The vellum had the same typed word, trust. It was as if someone had tried to destroy paper that would link Celeste to a decision she might have made. Anyone can rip a paper. The act of trying to remove a line and discard it is a more deliberate act. When someone makes the effort to burn an item they intend to remove, it suggests embarrassment or fear. By the time dusk came again, the house had folded its little discoveries into itself. The constable kept an eye on the visitors' rooms and asked us not to leave the property. I sat in the tasting room and listened to the rain build a soft curtain over the vines. The small clues were gathering themselves into something that had the shape of choice, a missing decanter, a scrap of trust, an empty tin, a burner of paper. Each clue alone did not demand a verdict. Together they were a language. I wanted to learn its grammar before I tried to speak. There are moments in an investigation when one small find changes the entire geometry of a question. It happened slowly at Marigold Ridge. We had, by then, a constellation of facts: a missing decanter, a scrap of vellum with the word trust, a half-full glass, a tin that was not where it should have been. The constable catalogued these things with quiet competence. I collected them in my notebooks the way one gathers shells at the edge of the sea. The real shift came when Marco, who had been down in the cellar checking a valve, found a small glass vessel beneath an old workbench. It had been wrapped in coarse cloth and tucked away as if for safekeeping. When he brought it into the light, the house seemed to hold its breath. It was the decanter, but marred and bearing faint stains at its mouth. Inside, a small residue remained. The presence of the decanter where it should not have been was an inconvenience for any tidy narrative. It meant that someone who knew the place had moved it. Marco said plainly that the way it had been wrapped showed knowledge of how to handle fragile glass, a consequence of someone who worked with such implements often. When the constable checked the grounds again, he found, tucked beneath an old plank near the compost, a small flattened tin. It was the tin Jonah had shown me earlier, now empty and with a smear as if something soft had been pushed out of it. The tin had, in the seam, a trace of dried film. I do not like to hold on to the desire to match objects to persons as if the world were a crime board. But objects make accounts. The decanter had been secreted and then half buried. The tin had been discarded near the compost. There was, in the arrangement, the feel of someone hastily trying to erase something and then, perhaps in the morning's panic, leaving the things where they might be found later. The forensic team finally arrived from the county late that day. They moved with an economy that made their presence calm. They took samples with gentle hands. I watched as they sealed the decanter, noted the scrap of vellum in the fire pit, and took the tin to examine its residue. Forensics confirmed what we had only suspected in the privacy of private thought. The residue in the decanter and the tin matched. There were traces of an unfamiliar compound. The forensic lead explained to the constable that the compound was a sedative in its medicinal form, used under prescription. It was not a dramatic thing, it was clinical. They could not conclude without further tests whether the amount found would be fatal, and they cautioned us that appearances could be deceptive. But the link between decanter and tin was, at least, clear. When I sat with Jonah that evening, he was no longer the collected, guarded man I had seen in the tasting room days earlier. His hand shook when it rested on his knee. "I did not," he began, and then stopped. People in shock tell the truth often in pieces, because the whole of what they know is too large to hold. Jonah told me that he had argued with Celeste again, quietly, in the weeks before. She had spoken of placing the land in trust, of protecting it from sale. He said he had felt the world close a little around him when the word trust came up. The trust means no sale, he said. I thought if she did that, there would be no hope of getting enough to start over. His voice was small in the room. He did not say he would kill her, or that he had any plan. He said only that he had stayed up that night, thinking of ways to persuade her. He had been to the office, he said, and had spoken to her. He admitted, with a voice that seemed to fall away from him, that he had held the decanter for a moment and wondered if he could fix everything in an hour. I did not press him to say more. Instead, I asked about the tin and the residue. He said he had been trying to stay clean, that sometimes he carried pills for the old cravings that would creep in at odd times. The tin, he admitted with bitter honesty, had been in his pocket. He had no memory of pouring anything into a glass, he said. He could not account for steps he had taken in a night that felt to him both long and short. When I spoke to Marco about the cellar and the decanter, he was straightforward. Whoever handled that decanter knew what they were doing, he said. They took out a stopper and wrapped the glass. That is not a clumsy act. It is someone who has worked near glass." That remark could have been about any of us who had handled the tools of the place, but the tin found near the compost had been Jonah's. The seal of the envelope and the scrap of vellum suggested that someone had tried to remove evidence that Celeste had been preparing a legal change. And Jonah, when he spoke, admitted to being in the office. Proof is a slow material. It comes by way of confirmations and the linking of otherwise separate facts. The tin matched the decanter. Jonah had been in the office. A scrap about trust had been burned and half hidden. Celeste's ledger remained closed but for a ribbon. These were points of contact that, placed together, suggested an action that was not only possible but plausible. Yet even plausibility is not a verdict, and I wanted, as always, to let what I had gathered sit in light before I drew any conclusion. Jonah told me in the night that his love for the place had an ache that sometimes felt like a bitter thing in his chest. He had left to check the pump, he said, and he had returned and spoken to Celeste. He had handled the decanter, he admitted, because he had wanted to set a cup in front of her to discuss the future. The detail that turned the night was his pause in the middle of that admission. I wanted to make her listen. Those are the words that end not in violence, but in a desperate desire to be heard. There is a difference, and yet the line between them can be a narrow river when someone is tired and has been shut out for years. Pieces were placed. The decanter, the tin, the scrap, the confession of presence. The house settled and the rain continued its long, tireless talk on the roof. I kept my notes safe. In the next days the evidence would be tested and people would be called upon to account for their nights. For now, the missing piece had been found, and it made the shape of a question sharper than before. Forensics do their quiet work like patient readers. The county lab returned a preliminary report. The residue in the decanter and in the tin contained a sedative compound consistent with prescription medication. The levels indicated the sedative had been present in the glass. The report did not, and could not, in those early pages, equate presence with intent. Toxicology would take time, and the exact cause would need to wait until clearer tests were complete. Even so, the language of the report made a small opening for interpretation. When factual threads begin to converge like this, human threads tighten in sympathy or in fear. Jonah's confession to being in the office that night, his admission of holding the decanter, the tin found near the compost, these things together shaped a straight line in the paper that needed still to be confirmed by motive and by state of mind. For a person in the center of it, life becomes a series of memories that flicker with doubt and longing. I spent long hours those days listening rather than questioning. People who are innocent of malice are often guilty of other softer things: envy, impatience, absence. Jonah, for instance, was not callous. He sobered at the edge of Marigold Ridge, like a man unsure how to set foot into a history that had continued without him. He told me how his father had left when Jonah was small, and how Celeste had looked after him in capacious ways that sometimes felt like a hand that both held and steered. I wanted to do more, he said. I wanted to fix things. There are reasons people commit foolish acts. There are other reasons they commit still worse acts. The difference is often not visible to a casual onlooker. Marco, in his grief, showed a different ache. He spoke of the vineyard as a living thing, of how land remembers hands. If the trust happens, he said quietly, it keeps the land from being sold to someone who will tear it apart. It is a kind of sanctuary. Daniel, when he spoke of the trust, framed it in a very different language. He said he understood the need for preservation, but also the realities of running a place like this. He was, in that sense, the mercantile edge that meets art at the counter of business. Harriet read the letters aloud, small excerpts that Celeste had once kept folded in the ledger, words that spoke of promises and guarantees, of a wish that the land survive as a gift rather than a commodity. The letters indeed were practical. They mentioned names and dates, and a line about a possible conservancy that might hold the property in perpetuity. If Celeste were to place the vineyard into a trust, certain opportunities would be closed, and certain inheritances would be reshaped. It is not hard to understand Jonah's distress in a pragmatic sense. If he had been depending on a sale as an opportunity to leave with funds enough to begin again, the trust would extinguish that hope. But understanding does not excuse. It does, however, provide context. The forensic report, combined with Jonah's presence in the office and the discovery of the decanter and the tin, formed a complaint that made sense. What remained unclear was whether Jonah intended to kill Celeste. He had told Celeste, he admitted, how desperate he felt, and he had handled the decanter to offer her a conversation. He had a small tin that sometimes held pills. The presence of the sedative in both decanter and tin suggested that something had been moved between the two. One could imagine a scenario in which Jonah, in a panic or in a state of high emotion, intended to render Celeste unconscious long enough to force her to sign a paper or to change her mind. It is the desperate person's logic to remove a barrier by removing the agency of the other. It is a plan both cold and intimate, because it involves the most private of exchanges, a cup shared between two people whom one hopes to persuade. Alistair Crowe, I remind myself in the mirror of the house, is not a man who prefers the loud accusation. I prefer to gather patterns until they weigh heavily enough to be unignorable. So I thought through the opportunity, motive, and the action. The opportunity was there. Celeste had the decanter at hand. The office was private enough for a conversation. Jonah had access and a tin. The motive was clear in his confessions, the fear of losing a future he had imagined. The action was suggested by the residue and the physical presence of the decanter where it should not have been. What we do next with a person who has confessed to being in the room and to handling an object that might have been the vehicle for harm is delicate. The constable and the county investigators had duties to discharge. They asked Jonah questions that night and took him to the station for custody to preserve the integrity of the investigation. He was not yet under formal arrest, but he was being held while they finished toxicology and interviews. In some ways, the calm of the procedure was a mercy. It allowed for the truth to make itself heard without the theatre of accusation. I sat with Marco afterward in the tasting room and watched how he moved his hands over the grain of the table. "God," he said, "I never thought of him as dangerous. I just thought he was lost." It is rarely useful to name someone as evil. Most often, malice is the final garment donned by someone who has been cold for a long time. Jonah, in his statements, did not read as a villain. He read as a person who had been pushed toward a kind of private panic. That is an awful distinction, a human at the edge who pulls a desperate act across the threshold into tragedy. There is law. There is also narrative. In the days that followed, the forensic results grew firmer. The sedative was present in Celeste's glass. Traces were found in Jonah's tin. The evidence suggested transfer. Whether the transfer had been intended to kill remained, in the early technical sense, unproven. But in the communal sense, once you place the facts together, the picture sharpens. I walked the rows of Marigold Ridge that evening, letting the vines hold the quiet around me. Truths converged like converging paths. Each one makes the other clearer. The world offers no simplicity. It offers layers upon layers. You peel them back, and then you must sit with what you find. I sat with what was left of Celeste's lamp and the stillness of the house, and the knowledge that in the morning we would speak again, and that there would be more to gather before any final word could be spoken. Jonas sat in the interview room with his jacket folded on his knees and the small tin on the metal table between us. He looked smaller in the institutional light than he had in the warm rooms of the house. He was not the sort of person who wanted to be the center of any story. The ruin of that desire sat on his face like a bruise. "I wanted to talk to her," he said when the county detective, patient and precise, left us alone for a moment. "I thought if I could just make her hear me. I thought if she felt sorry, if she changed her mind, then maybe I would have a chance." There is often a shape to confessions that makes them feel like reed-making, slender, fragile, and small. Jonah admitted that he had gone to the office, that he had taken the decanter from the table and held it in his hand. He wanted, he said, to offer Celeste a glass and to talk. He told us honestly that he had been terrified of losing the chance of a sale to start over, of being left once more without the road under his feet. "I had the tin," he said, "and there were pills in it, and I took one because my hands were shaking. I didn't mean to hurt her." He said he had meant to incapacitate rather than to kill. He thought, he said, he could make her sleep enough to force her hand at will. He did not think, he added with a voice like a rag, of doses or of the quiet of the body when it is taken by medicine beyond measure. He had no plan except to make the person who had closed doors to him listen again. There is a small necessary distinction between intention and outcome. That distinction is also where morality and law often meet and then part ways. Jonah's intent, as he described it, was not to murder in a cold way, but to silence the barrier between himself and the life he wanted. The sedative he used was not chosen for violence, but for sleep. He had misread its strength, and Celeste had not come back from the sleep he had given her. The consequences were final and terrible. The detective listened and made notes, but did not interrupt the way a person should not interrupt grief. He asked only about details when Jonah had been in the office, whether anyone else had come in and out, his recollection of how the decanter had felt in his hands. Jonah's answers were simple and true in the way that small children tell of an accident, plain, with a kind of stunned regret. After the conversation, I stepped outside with Jonah for a while. The rain had stopped and the soil breathed a fresh, clean smell. We walked the path between the rows. "I loved this place," he said finally, "more than I can say. But Celeste was right to care for it. I loved what it is, not what it could give me. I know that now." Admission had tactile edges. Jonah's voice had the brittle honesty of someone who had been living with a kind of bleakness and then realized too late the price his actions would claim. The truth he offered was not a confession prepared for mercy. It was a small, raw attempt to make his story into something that might be heard. The county investigators, when they had sufficient grounds, charged Jonah with an offense appropriate to the nature of the evidence. The legal work unfolded in ways I will not recount in detail because it concerns courts and formalities. What I will say is that Jonah did not deny what his hands had done. He did not claim to be a monster. He claimed to be a man who had been cornered by his own fears and had acted without calculation. The reaction among the small group was not theatrical. Marco retreated to his cellar and tended the wood, letting the steady work keep him going. Harriet, who had once been a friend of Celeste, read aloud lines from their correspondence in a tone that made them sound like a eulogy. Daniel folded his papers and left earlier than expected, his face composed but remote. Lila walked the vines and then made a bouquet to place by the desk where Celeste had been found. It would be easy to end the story there, to say that the law found its measure and that the house settled into its sorrow. The truth is more complicated, as it always is. Jonah made his choice, and he must answer for it. In private, between the county interviews and the arraignment, there were moments that asked for something different than judgment. There were moments that asked for a reckoning that was human and not only legal. There were phone calls made to families, there were apologies that could not be returned, and there was a small private meeting in the tasting room where Lila and Marco and I sat and watched the light shift. I do not tell you this to soften what happened. I tell you because the truth in such places is not only a matter of statutes. The truth is also the story of a nephew who returned and found himself on the wrong side of a system of care. A woman who had been thinking in the long term about what the land deserved, and a group of people who had landed on the property on one particular evening and had been asked, by the course of events, to witness a sorrow. Jonah was not a monstrous man. He was a man who had been left with too few options. That explanation does not excuse him, but it does, perhaps, make the action comprehensible in the way that human actions can be when seen in the context of love and fear, abandonment and desire. It is the kind of motive that is tragic precisely because it is recognizably human. When the formalities were underway and the house had been made a place of evidence and of visits, I sat once more in the tasting room and looked at the photograph on the desk. Celeste's face in the picture was bright and half amused. The house held her absence like a field does, a memory. People move through their days with an odd mixture of small forgiveness and a need for the world to answer. Before Jonah was taken away for the next phase of the legal process, he asked to see Celeste's ledger. He wanted to know what she had written. He wanted, he said simply, to understand whether she had intended a trust or a sale. The ledger, when it was opened, revealed lines of careful accounting and a short note written in Celeste's neat hand about keeping promises to the land. The ribbon lay across it like a soft hand closing. I walked Jonah to the car under the flat sky. He did not look like a man who had wanted to do harm as the end goal. He looked like someone who had allowed a fear to become a plan. It is a small mercy, perhaps, that we can see the reasons people break. It does not erase the breaking. It only lets us look at it and say that the story contains more than one sort of sorrow. The weeks that followed the events at Marigold Ridge were slow in the way of late winter. The vines went deeper into themselves, the barrels sighed, and the house took on the private business of healing. Jonah's case proceeded through the calm machinery of the law. People said things in measured tones and kept their appointments. There was a company of quiet about the place, as if the house itself had become a balm for the grief it held. I spent mornings walking the rows, watching how the ground slept beneath its thin crust of frost. The vineyard, in its slow way, was not a place that could be hurried. Decisions about trusts and sales require time and a steady hand. Celeste had been, in life, someone who measured by the long view, and that impulse survived her. The trust she had been drafting remained under advisement, a legal thing that weighed as much as it mattered, preserving the land in a manner that seemed in the days after to honor her care. People returned to their lives with the peculiar bruise left by such a disruption. Marco kept to the cellar and to the barrels. He spoke of keeping the casks warm, of measuring what remained in a way that made his days purposeful. Lila arranged flowers at the desk and left a small bouquet where Celeste had died. Harriet wrote a piece that was an elegy in halves and snippets, a careful account that remembered the woman and the things she loved. Daniel, who had seen opportunity and also promise, withdrew gracefully, his hands folded around the things that were now less certain. Jonah's presence, for a time, was only memory. He was in custody, a fact of procedure. But memory is a living thing, and those who remain carry it differently. Some will turn memory into care. Some will turn it into a lesson. Some will tuck it away like a folded note. I sat often in the tasting room with a cup of tea and watched the light move across the desk. People asked me in small voices what I had made of things. To each I said the same sort of quiet, there was grief here and there was a human failure. We are not made only of our best intentions. Sometimes the worst of ourselves falls out when we are pressed. A few weeks after the events, a group from the local conservation trust arrived. They sat around the table and spoke of legal instruments and stewardship. They had the practical calm of people whose work requires them to think in decades. The idea of the trust, which had been a small scrap of vellum in the fire pit, and then a larger possibility in the ledger, slowly became real. The trust would keep the land from fragmenting. It would also shape futures that were not Jonah's, but belonged to the community and to those who tended the vines. It is not for me to say whether it was right. I will say that Celeste had wanted to protect the soil from short-term hunger, and that, in the end, her care found a way to continue. That fact made an odd sort of peace. In the gentle breezes of a late winter afternoon, I walked with Lila through the rows. She carried another small bouquet, and she spoke quietly of Celeste in the same way one speaks of someone one has loved. She kept things, Lila said, not for herself. She kept them for the next hand. We stood for a while beside a low mound where Celeste had once planted an apple tree that never quite matured. The ground smelled honest and wet. Lila placed the bouquet on the tasting room desk where the photograph still rested, its edges softened by being handled. "There is so much memory in a place like this," she murmured. "It is good when we remember it right. Memory as an ethics is a topic I think about often. We remember to honor, and we remember to learn. The events at Marigold Ridge asked both of those things of us. Jonah would have to live with what he had done and its consequences. The law would do its portion. The humans who remained would need to reconcile their feelings and their hopes for the place that had held both warmth and rupture. When I left Marigold Ridge, I felt the sort of ache that is not raw but patient. I watched the line of the vines as the road bent away, the house breathing quietly in its valley. People had been flawed. They had done what flawed people do. They loved and they feared in equal measure. The result had been a tragedy that did not flatten anyone into a cartoon of evil. It made them, instead, complex and sorrowful, a picture of human life in which a single desperate act can change the outline of a place. Back in the city, I write the small details I collected and fold them into a story that tries to be gentle and honest. Celeste's ledger remains, in the end, a record of a life that loved land. A trust was arranged to protect the Vineyard. Jonah, in the attentions he offered later, sought to make amends in ways that were not sufficient to rewrite consequence but were sincere. I have often said the truth in these cases is a quiet companion. It does not always bring comfort, but it brings clarity, and that allows the living to move forward. At Marigold Ridge the vines will sleep and thaw in due season. People will return to their daily rules, and the house will hold its memories like a vessel. I offer this not as a tidy moral, but as a quiet observation. People are knots of love, hurt, hope, and fear. Sometimes those knots come undone and tangle others. The work we must do afterward is to remember with care and to tend what remains. Thank you for joining me in this soft place. As you close your eyes, I hope the steady rose of the vineyard and the quiet light of the tasting room stay with you for a while, gentle and unhurried. If you have been listening closely, perhaps you saw the shapes of things settle before I spoke them plainly. If you enjoyed the story, please like, subscribe, and follow, and do keep the comments kind and free of spoilers. Until the next quiet case, sleep well.